When you think of English kings, few names command a legacy as powerful as mythic as Henry V. He's this figure forged in battle, immortalized in literature, and really, he's seen as the absolute pinnacle of a medieval warrior king. But how much of that legend is actually true?
Right? This is the image we all have in our heads. The heroic leader giving one of the most famous speeches ever written, firing up his exhausted army against impossible odds. It's a picture of pure, unshakable heroism. Because you see, behind that Shakespearean legend and all those battlefield victories, there's a much more complex and, frankly, a much more fascinating historical figure. And that's exactly who we're going to explore today. To find the real Henry, we've got to go back to before he was king, back to his youth. And the very first thing we have to do, we have to toss out that popular myth of the wild, rebellious Prince Hal, the one who was always carousing in taverns. I mean, just look at the contrast here. It's night and day. That whole story of a riotous youth was most likely just political spin from rival factions at court, who saw this really capable young prince as a threat. The reality? By the time he was a teenager, Henry was already a soldier, commanding troops in Wales. And this idea that he avoided politics? Not a chance. As his father's health started to fail, the young prince was right at the center of government, pretty much running the country. And look, Henry's reputation as a battle-hardened warrior, that wasn't just some title he was given. Oh no, it was earned in the most brutal way you can imagine, at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. This one event would define him, physically and symbolically, for the rest of his life. Just try to imagine this. You're 16 years old. An arrow slams into your face. The arrow had buried itself a full 6 inches into his cheekbone, fracturing his skull. Any ordinary soldier would have died right then and there. But the royal physician, a guy named John Bradmore, performed what was basically a medical miracle. He actually designed a brand new surgical tool to screw into the arrowhead and pull it out, then clean the wound with alcohol. Henry survived, but he carried those scars for the rest of his life, a permanent, visible reminder that this king's place was on the battlefield. So when he finally does take the throne in 1413, this experienced, battle-scarred man isn't interested in small-time issues. Nope, he immediately turns his attention to the biggest prize of all, the crown of France. Now, this wasn't some rash decision. It was a totally calculated political and military move. First, he was reviving a long-standing English dynastic claim, this idea that English kings had a right to the French throne through their ancestry. But just as important, France was vulnerable. Its king, Charles VI, had these terrible bouts of mental illness, and the country was being torn apart by a civil war between powerful nobles. For Henry, this was a perfect storm, a chance to secure his legacy and unite his own country behind one massive cause. And this, of course, brings us to the campaign that would define his entire reign, the 1415 invasion of France, which all came to a head at the legendary Battle of Agincourt. And let me tell you, the situation for Henry and his army could not have been more desperate. Okay, so let's just look at the matchup here. The English were sick, they were starving, they were totally exhausted from a long, miserable march. And as you can see, they were massively outnumbered by a fresh, confident French army fighting on its own turf. On paper, this was an absolute suicide mission. So how on earth did they win? Well, it came down to a few key things you see here: the terrain and the tech. Heavy rain had turned the battlefield into a muddy swamp, which was a nightmare for the heavily armored French knights. They got stuck, becoming easy targets for the devastating English longbow. But another huge factor was Henry's leadership. He didn't command from the rear. He was on foot, in the thick of it, fighting with his men, being the warrior king. The impact was immediate, and it was immense. Agincourt wasn't just a battle, it was a national sensation. It totally validated Henry's kingship, legitimized his claim to France, and sent this incredible shockwave of patriotic pride all across England. Agincourt was the key that unlocked everything for him. It absolutely shattered French morale and allowed Henry to just press his advantage for the next 5 years, conquering huge parts of northern France and forcing the French king to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Troyes, which was just an unbelievable diplomatic win. It disinherited the French king's own son and named Henry V the regent and the heir to the French throne. Then, by marrying the king's daughter, Catherine of Valois, he cemented this union that would, once the sick old French king died, join the crowns of England and France under a single ruler. This timeline just shows you how quickly it all came together, and then how tragically it all fell apart. In 1420, he's the heir. In 1421, he has a son to inherit both kingdoms. The plan is perfect. But then, in August 1422, at the absolute peak of his power, Henry dies of dysentery, a horrible intestinal disease that was super common in medieval army camps. He was only 35. And the ultimate twist of fate? The French king, the one whose throne he was supposed to inherit, dies just 2 months later. He was that close.
So why do we still talk about him? Well, because his short reign had a massive impact. He helped forge a powerful sense of English identity, made England a feared military power, and created a legend that, thanks to Shakespeare, has captivated all of us for over 400 years. And that leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? Was he the inspirational hero of Agincourt we all love? Or was he a ruthless conqueror, a man known for executing prisoners and starving civilians during sieges? The answer, just like the man himself, is complicated. He was a warrior king whose brutal, brilliant, and tragically short reign changed the course of 2 nations forever.